This is Ray Blair with Acorn Productions, known to anybody who actually watches these videos as Mr. Blair. Hey, first of all, instead of fixing the last video, I'm just going to show you all the images I kind of butchered by pushing off to the side of the corner. So we were in timeline 4, and we're gonna finish out the social context of timeline 4 today. But here are some of our images about the three-part economy there. You've got western wheat farmers, northwestern wheat farmers, northern factories, and southern cotton plantations. You have your American system image from that video. Gosh, I'm still struggling on this. The three-legged stool of trying to have a system of protective tariffs, a national bank, and internal improvements or road building to help strengthen the overall economy, especially make it ready for times of war, but also to bind a self-sufficient economy together. And you have the fire bell that rang in the night, the Missouri Compromise, which is going to be an important context. This is going to last till 1850. It's going to be a very important context in timeline number 5 as the Missouri Compromise falls apart. But please don't put the Missouri Compromise in the period of the 1850s. It happened in 1820 and lasted a long time. So that was good. So the Jacksonian democracy had was in many ways about the common man. The stuff I'm going to talk about here was generally more appealing to the Whigs. This is more of the kind of middle class approach to shape out their society. And it was there was a wave of reform movements in which people went out about common man and tried to make change in their country. And it was triggered by a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. You see, I drew a church pew. Of the drawings you're going to see, that's not the worst one. And with the Second Great Awakening, it was very similar to the First Great Awakening. What you want, and sorry, you're going to have to look this up, but what you want is Charles Grandison Finney is going to be your leading evangelist in the New York area where the Erie Canal had just been built and instant towns were sprouting out all over the place. This was a person who was trained as a lawyer and was drawn to the service of God, and he became extremely effective at talking people in revival movements into coming to the faith and being more active. Among the messages of the Second Great Awakening included perfectionism and millennialism. Perfectionism is what I'll focus on. I think it's the easiest to grasp. Just trying to improve a better society. If you improve society, ultimately if you perfect it, but if you improve society, then that better environment for all is going to mean that more people make it to heaven. And another thing about the Second Great Awakening is this is really driving home the modern turn to religion in which the individual, very democratic, the individual is responsible for their own salvation, and they have control. The person themselves has control of whether they go to heaven or not. The reform movements that come out of this as people leave the pews on Sunday is that we should make improvements to our society so that more people are in a better condition to go to heaven, a better position to go to heaven. So they looked around and they looked to improve societies. They did this in both social movements and in the creation of utopian societies. The major social movements included temperance and abolition, both moral-based. Now you have a movement that is gaining strength in supporters that is saying that abolitionism is morally wrong and it makes it difficult for anyone involved, but especially the slave owners, to make it to heaven because it's wrong. Slavery is wrong. It should be removed as an institution. And the leading abolitionist is William Lloyd Garrison, and he will be joined as he runs away and joins the cause by Frederick Douglass, his leading African American evangelist. And then there are a host of reform movements, but you're going to want at least two. And another way to improve society was to reduce the amount of drinking. And there was a tremendous amount of drinking, in part because water wasn't trusted very much. So there's a tremendous amount of drinking in society, and temperance reformers focused on the social ills and the moral lapses that came with it. Now, a lot of the people who were involved in reform movements were women, and women reformers who were kind of extending some of their natural roles as caretakers of religious ideas into public. We're also running into the limitation that's going to last through the 20th century, and that women were not supposed to, by social custom, be active in public, be publicly speaking. So, in participating in these movements, many women became very concerned about their role in society. So, here is a fantastic drawing of a waterfall. In attending the International Convention on Abolition in London, and I said that wrong, but in attending an international leading event on abolition in London, women were not allowed to be seated in this convention. And women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott returned to the United States sure that women's rights needed to be addressed, that the limitations on women's society did not match up to the ideals of the American Revolution. So the cause and effect here is in trying to participate in reform movements like abolition and temperance, women faced and realized some of their limitations needed to be changed. And at the Seneca Falls Convention, a whole host of things were agreed to in the Declaration of Sentiments. And the only really issue that was up for debate among the people who attended, including Frederick Douglass and many supportive men, but it was primarily led by women, was the issue of whether women should ask for the vote. And in a close vote, the Seneca Falls Convention said women should get the vote. That reform, which is kind of the tail end of the other reform movements, is going to die as the issue of slavery divides the country and becomes the central focus in the 1850s. And it is not until the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, in which specifically African American men are given the vote, that women are going to relaunch their movement, feeling betrayed by the results of the abolition movement and having the Civil War issues be resolved by that point. At the same time that these social reform movements came about, there were a series of movements to try to create ideal societies that didn't try to persuade everyone else to join them. So Brook Farm was a transcendentalist society in which the idea of getting back to the earth was really good for the intellectual movement. And it turns out intellectuals aren't that great farmers. And the local neighbors said, "Hey, aren't you really smart? Will you teach our kids?" And the community seemed to thrive a little bit by accident. And then there was a major fire that made things come to a halt. New Harmony was an ideal socialist industrial community that was created in Indiana. The founder, Robert Owen, had successfully used socialist principles in running a factory in England, and tried to recreate this here. Other reform movements that you might want to look at include the Oneida Community and the Shakers. And then the Mormons, who have are creating a new society based around the Mormon beliefs that Joseph Smith unveiled or discovered in upstate New York, found themselves really, along with their vision of Christianity, clashing with neighboring communities over their strong communitarian ideals instead of the individualism that was such a trend and such a strain through American history. And they were chased out of New York, then Ohio, and then Missouri, where the government basically issued a death threat to all Mormons, and then Illinois, where their founder, Joseph Smith, was extracted from a prison and lynched. Then the Mormon community moved out west to Mexico in 1847 and 1848. Their part of Mexico they moved to is Utah, and shortly thereafter the United States acquired that territory from Mexico. So the Mormon story is a transition story between the utopian reform communities of this period and the manifest destiny spread out west stories of time period 5. In this time period, there is a flowering of national culture. Yours truly is a little bit subdued in my interpretation of this. While the United States creates independent literature, philosophy, art, and sciences, really it's still very close to European society. For example, the most famous of these movements, Transcendentalism, is very similar to the European philosophical movement of Romanticism. And, and it is a philosophy that has had an enduring impact on American society. Transcendentalism is essentially questioning what happens when we get too bound up in civilized life and cities and factory life and get separated um, from nature, and when our lives get so complex that we have a hard time kind of focusing on essential truths. So Walden and Emerson were the leading transcendentalists. Walden is the one, I'm sorry, Thoreau and Emerson are the leading transcendentalists, and this is a drawing of Walden Pond where Henry David Thoreau moved not that far out of town and built a cheap cabin to live in nature. And the cynic in me says he still went back to basically get meals from his aunt down the street pretty regularly. But it's the idea of simplicity, that if you keep your life simple, that your life is going to be much more rich. And it is a cautionary tale about American industrialism and consumerism. That Thoreau argued, among other things, that you don't own your possessions; they own you. And a lot of the things Americans do to this day are are doing things to pay for things, for mortgages, etc. And Walden questioned the materialism and felt that if we connected to Thoreau and Walden, if we connected better to nature, then we would be more in tune with essential truths. So that's a very brief statement about transcendentalism. If you're trying to come up with examples of the flowering of American culture at this time period, you have Audubon and his birds. You have Noah Webster and his dictionary. You have the emergence of literary movements. Margaret Fuller was a female transcendentalist who created the magazine The Dial to help promote transcendentalism. There was the Hudson River movement that painted rich American landscapes, sometimes exaggerated American landscapes, to feature the value of nature. So this is the social movement that's going on, flourishing during the Jacksonian time period. And there's lots of examples to dig into, but you should be aware of it. You should be able to explain what transcendentalism was. It's a little bit tricky to figure out how it fits in with the Second Great Awakening and reform movements, but this is a time of great questioning about what America is as a society. It's the time period when de Tocqueville came as a visitor from Europe, from France, and wrote on America, or wrote his observations of American democracy. And this is a time period when the people of the United States were really being self-aware about who they were and how they did things, and these reform movements were part of that. So not a short version, but this is a little story about period 4 reform movements, and I will stop that there.